Now we're going to explore using databases, using Access as a database manager. And again, we're going to be using the data that underlies this story about Pfizer's payments to doctors to lecture other doctors on the use of its drugs. So here we are in Access, a database manager. Now databases contain tables. This one has a table called Pfizer. When I open it, by double clicking on it, you will see it's basically the same data that we looked at before in Excel. It has those more than 10,000 entries for payments to doctors by Pfizer. There are a number of differences between a database and a spreadsheet, however. Databases are a bit more rigid, but they can be more nimble for filtering. We call it querying in a database data, particularly large data sets. So let's have a look at this table. The columns in a database are called fields. Once you can edit them, but once you've got those column headings, they stay as you run the queries. They're fixed, and you'll see that each one is rather more simplified than before. That it'll become apparent why later on. Now, in a spreadsheet, as we saw, you have a sort of flexible coordinate system where the rows will change their coordinate, as the data will get a different row number as it's resorted. That doesn't happen in a database. Each row has a unique identifier. Here it's a number, and it's called a primary key in a database. We will add a primary key to a data table later on. So everything's a little bit more rigid, but databases are optimized really for searching for data, as we're going to see. So let's run our first query. And what I'm going to do is the same filter operation we did in Excel. I'm going to select doctors in California who ran expert-led forums and were paid $10,000 or more for doing so. I'm going to show you two ways to do it. One is a way that is specific to Excel, a point-and-click way, and then I'm going to show you how the database actually interprets that information and how you can write queries from scratch. Okay. So first, the point-and-click way. To do that, we go to Create and then Query Design. We get an option then to add tables. We only have one, so I'm going to add it. I can close that down. Now we need to populate this grid at the bottom with the fields we want to return in our query. Don't need to worry about table. I only have one, so I select the fields I want. So let's have the first name plus any middle initials and so on, the last name of the doctor, the city, the state, the category of payment, and the total they were paid. Now if I were to run the query at this point, what I get back would be every row in the database for those fields. That's not what I want. I need to filter, and I do that under criteria. So first, filter by state. Write the two-letter abbreviation for California, hit return. Excel recognizes that it's text and puts quote marks around it. Now I'm going to do something similar for category, but I'm going to show you another trick you can use. So I'm actually not going to write out expert-led forums in full. I'm going to go like expert and asterisk. Now, what that has done, asterisk is a wildcard. So it asks the database to look for everything, in this case, that begins with expert. And you can use asterisk in various ways. I could have done asterisk forums, for example, and I would have obtained in this database the same result. Okay, and finally the total, I need to say greater or equal to 10,000. Okay, one last thing I'm going to do before I run this query is tell the database that I want the results in descending order of the size of the payments. Okay, do that under sort. Now, if I run that query, I get the same list of 31 doctors that we had before, with Gerald Michael Sachs of Santa Monica there at the top. So I'm going to save this query so I can come back to it later. Just hit Control S, get an option to save the query, and I'll call it CA 10,000 plus. Okay, to save that, and now it's saved there at the left. Now, I'm going to show you how the database actually interpreted that. I'm going to go down to the bottom right, and I can select this button that has SQL written on it. SQL is structured query language. Now, when Access writes these queries automatically, they end up a little bit more complicated than they may actually need to be. So I'm going to break out of Access now and show you a simpler way of writing this query in structured query language. And I must stress, learning SQL is a really good idea, because this is a skill which will transfer to other database managers. So if we look at this query, you'll see first there is a select statement. Select the fields we want. So we have first underscore plus, comma last, comma city, and so on. Fields are separated by commas. The next thing is from. That defines the table the fields come from. So here it's from Pfizer. The next is where. Now where is our filter. So here we have where state equals CA in quote marks, and category is like expert asterisk in quote marks, and total is greater or equal to 10,000. The last part of the statement is order by, that is the sort. So we order by total in descending order, DESC, and the entire SQL statement ends with a semicolon. So let's run another query. This one is going to be the subtotal operator we did previously in Excel. So I want to get the total of the payments for each state for all of the categories combined. So again, to do it the point and click way, we go to Create, Query Design, add our table again, and we need to put in the fields that we're going to need for this query. Well, for this one there's just two. It is state and it is total. But we need to do another thing when we're summing things up or we're doing an aggregation of the data. And basically we need to click this totals button at the top. Now that adds a new row to the grid at the bottom called total, and you'll see that its default entry is group by. Now you can think of group by as kind of what you do when you get a hand of cards. Probably the first thing you're going to do is to group the cards by suit, hearts, spades, diamonds, clubs. Well, here similarly we're grouping the payments by state. We don't want to group them by total, however. We want to add them up, which is sum. You can see there are other options as well, but we're going to go with sum, and then I'm going to do a sort as well as before. Let's put them in descending order, so the state with the largest total of payments appears at the top of the query results, and again hit run, and we have each of the states. Actually there's DC and Puerto Rico in here as well, so there's 52 in total, and California at the top with the sum of 4.7, just over million, as we saw before in Excel. So let's just save that query, total by state, before we look at it in SQL. So let's look at the SQL version of this query. Begins with a select statement as before, select state, comma. Gets a bit more complicated after that. We want the sum of the total. And then the as state underscore total, that just gives a new heading for the relevant column in the results. It has a from, Pfizer, as before, defining the table that those fields come from. The group by statement comes next. It's group by state. And finally, once again, as sort, order it by the sum of the total in descending order, DESC, semicolon. So before we finish with this query, I want to show you how you can export data out of Access into Excel if you want to play around with it later. So I've selected the query. If I right click, I get an option to export, and I can export to Excel into whatever folder I want. Export it as a Excel workbook, click OK, and that was now there as a spreadsheet for me to use later. Okay, I'm going to run just one more query to complete this video, and it is the pivot table that we did previously in Excel. I'll show you how to do that in Access. So let's go to Create for a new query and Design View again. Add the table as before. So we're going to need the totals. So what fields do we want? So if you remember, we were totaling by state and category. So I need the field state. I need the field category. And I need the totals. And the totals need to be summed. Group by is correct for the other two. Now, I'm not going to run this just now, but if I go down to the bottom, you get a button for Pivot Table View. It's the second from the left. I'm going to click on that, and this will appear. And basically, I drop the fields into where I want them in my pivot table. So if you remember, we had state as the columns. We had category as the rows, and we can do it here. I drag and dropped it, but we can also add to row area. And the sum of the total, which is what we want, wants to go into the data area. Can close that down, and now we have our pivot table, much as we had it for all of the states and the grand totals. See, just over $35 million as before, as we did in Excel.